Hello, everybody. Um, I went for my pre-op stuff yesterday, and I ended up spending an awful lot of time sitting in the communal waiting room because, like a dork, I was there a half hour early, and as is typical of any kind of medical establishment, they were running way late, running behind. So they gave me this little booklet, which is Patient Information Guide, and it's the same guide that was there 3 years ago when I checked in for surgery. So really nothing had changed, but it was so boring in there. So I ended up people watching, and while I kind of pretended to read my little book, and in the back of it, there's a page for questions you might want to ask your doctor. Then in the little further in the back, there are 3 pages of lined pages of just for you to take notes. I had no medical notes that I wished to take, and I had no questions for my doctor. And looking at the pages in this book, they were just begging to be written on, and I thought probably most of the time they do not get written on. And all of these lined pages just get thrown away without anything on them. So I decided to sit down, see if I could fill 1 page, and then I thought maybe I can fill 2 pages, and it just went on and on until I had all 3 notes pages and the questions for the doctor's page filled. Just sort of, it's not fiction, not entirely fact. Let's say creative factual writing, creative nonfiction. I thought I'd read it to you just because. It's very, very messy. I have trouble reading my own handwriting, so I'm probably going to stumble around a little bit, but here it is. Just for shits and giggles. He was the man with the plain name, and she couldn't imagine a day spent without him. She sat in the hospital waiting room with old men in cowboy hats with rattling canes and thermoses of coffee they brought from home. They waited for their farm wives to finish being cut and altered by the hands of surgeons, and she felt lucky to not be there waiting for word of her plain-named lover, glancing again and again at the oversized screen that listed in grass green and doss blue the progress being made behind sterile doors. She waited there for herself and by herself, and knew that he'd be there if he could, and would forfeit whatever championship video game he was likely involved with at this very moment, to be seated between the bulky old men, his stomach lurching with worry, and watching for her one-of-a-kind name to appear like a delayed flight on the giant board. She tried not to stare as she saw a greasy white bobbed hairdo gliding towards her across the lobby. Beneath it was the pale, jowly face devoid of emotion, personality, or ornamentation. As the waist-high head got closer, she could see that the dowdy woman was in an electrified wheelchair that could comfortably seat 2 average-sized people. But it was at this moment serving as transport for what was surely the largest human being she had ever seen. The woman smoothly moved down the aisle like an inert slab of meat lying on a conveyor belt. She felt guilty for even thinking such a thing, and averted her gaze out the window, then to a large painting depicting an expressionist vision of a lilac-colored iris, then down to the oddly patterned carpeting. But there was nothing within 30 miles in any direction which was as fascinating as the amoebic-shaped woman. She tried to tell what the woman was wearing, but it was nearly impossible, as yards and yards of charcoal pinstripes folded and flowed into and over mounds of flesh, which had somehow along the way forgotten if they were a calf, a belly, or a breast, and just went with the flow, free-styling as they filled up with fat. She felt an odd kinship with this woman, although probably only 1/3 her size. She felt sure that if she had the plain-named man there with her, he too wouldn't be able to look away, and would take her hand and squeeze it tighter and tighter as the impossibly large woman rolled ever closer to them. He'd stare without shame, hoping to bear witness to the woman possibly rising up from her throne and daring her legs to not collapse under her crushing weight. Or maybe he'd cringe and frown, just feeling bad for someone that out of control. Although she knew he'd be embarrassed by it, she was sure that having him there would give her the courage to go over and ask the astounding sight 1,000,001 questions. She looked out the window and into the bright autumn sun. and when she looked back the woman had opened a National Enquirer in front of her doughy face, and somehow the sight became comical, and even though the plain-named man was oblivious in reality, the part of him that always lives, breathes, and fully exists with her at all times burst into laughter in her head. And although she would never laugh at someone so obviously afflicted, a smile erupted across her face, and she was forced to tightly press her fist against her red lipsticked mouth, and once again look out into the sun until her eyes watered. There was a dull buzz, the double doors opened, and someone in ugly Christmas-patterned scrubs stepped through them and muttered her name. As she approached the doors, the nurse looked at the chart and commented, "That's an uncommon name." She smiled and nodded. "Yes, I suppose it is." And the door shut behind them. And that's it. I ran out of space and I ran out of time. So anyway, that's what I do sometimes when I'm bored.